people were more and more likely to be interacting with people that they did not know, and more likely to be interacting with people that they did not know how to place socially. It's not just that they hadn't met, it's that I don't know your rank, I don't know your station, I don't know how I should be responding to you. Now, if that was happening in England, it was happening much, much faster in the United States.
Hello everyone! It is a huge pleasure to welcome you to today's BK21 lecture, where we are honored to host Reverend Dr. Ted Smith, a distinguished scholar and teacher working at the dynamic intersections of practical and political theology. Dr. Smith is an Associate Dean of Faculty and a professor at Ethics at Candler School of Theology, Emory University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, Professor Yoon, and thank you, Professor Kim. I want to make clear from the start, this project is parochial in some important ways. It is a US-centered project, or the lecture that I wanted to give, and that's partly because it would seem to me absurd for me to come and explain Korea to you. Of course, I cannot do that. So my thought instead is to follow Dipesh Chakrabarty's insight that what we have to do is provincialize Europe. We have to provincialize the United States, to acknowledge that this is not the center, that there is not a single trajectory that all will be following, but to say that we can work by analogy. What's happening in the United States might trigger some thoughts that you have about what's happening here, and then we can have an exchange of ideas in which we sharpen each of our understandings of our own contexts. I also want to acknowledge that the lecture is in English, and I want to thank you for that profound hospitality. That's a relic of empire. We should acknowledge that. And you all have turned that, though, into a source of generosity towards me to let me lecture in English. I thank you for that very profoundly. In anticipation of this trip, I wrote one of my doctoral advisees, who is now a professor at a seminary in the US, and I asked her for some suggestions for what my son and I might do while we are here in Seoul. She spent much of her childhood here, and then she returned to Korea on a Fulbright during her doctoral studies at Emory. And she sent a list of places that I imagine you could predict if I asked you for them. The Palace, Jongmyo Shrine, Insadong, Gwangjong Market, and the National Museum of Korea, you know, the usuals. She also included a list of what she called Instagram favorites, the places where everyone goes to take a selfie that shows the world that they have been to Seoul. Places like Common Ground, the Starfield Library, and the Lotte World Tower Skydeck. She knows that part of being in a place in this hyper-connected age is representing yourself as having been there. But in these fast-scrolling days, you can't expect people, let alone algorithms, to parse the details of some random photograph, even if it was a place that meant a lot to you. No, if you want people to know that you have been to Seoul, you have to post a selfie of yourself in one of the places where everyone takes a selfie in Seoul. This lets both humans and algorithmic readers see that you traveled to Seoul. It makes you legible. It makes you legible. In today's lecture, I want to argue that hyperconnectivity makes this kind of legibility an ideal for the self. And I position legibility as a successor to the sincerity that arose in the early modern period in the West and the authenticity that arose with Romanticism and that has become increasingly powerful as an ideal since the 1960s. I will argue that the rise of hyperconnectivity unravels the conditions in which both sincerity and authenticity make sense and lends new power to legibility. I will consider what I count as the most important critiques of legibility, especially from Byung-Chul Han. And I want to acknowledge these critiques. I agree with the main points of these critiques, but I disagree with their counterproposal. I think that they are assuming a restoration of the ideal of authenticity that is neither possible nor desirable. And I think a better critique of legibility imagines church as a community of mutual opacity and free belonging, where love and respect are given without comprehension. Church as a critique of legibility that is a community of mutual opacity and free belonging, where love and respect are given without comprehension. That's the destination, that's where we're going, and so you can quit now if you want. That's all there's going to be. All right, from sincerity to authenticity, the first point here. Writing from New York in the 1970s, the literary critic Lionel Trilling discerned a change in the culture. He saw a shift in ideals for the self from what he called sincerity to what he called authenticity. Trilling saw these ideals as inextricably linked to their historical contexts. Sincerity arose in Europe, he wrote, in the early modern period. It began to be displaced by an ideal of authenticity, first with the rise of Romanticism, and then with the migrations of expressive individualism back and forth across the North Atlantic and around the world. Trilling wrote that it makes no sense to say that a figure from late antiquity like Beowulf was insincere. That ideal wasn't even possible yet. Likewise, it would be silly to say that Confucius was inauthentic. That's a category mistake. He wasn't even trying for that ideal, and we misunderstand him if we think he was. So, this is the parochialization part of the lecture. These ideals of sincerity and authenticity are deeply rooted in particular historical epochs and contexts. They arise with particular configurations of culture and political economy. So let's consider each of those in turn. First, sincerity. As I'm trying to use the term here, borrowing from Trilling, it arose as an ideal in the early modern period. And it arose as the old class structure that governed Europe, and especially England, began to unravel. Now, in an organic society structured by inherited class, everyone knew who everyone else was, just by knowing who their parents were and their grandparents. But a cluster of developments that we gather together under the heading of modernity, including an industrial revolution that shifted power and status from landed aristocrats to a new capitalist class, migrations to cities and other places in which people interact with strangers, and a new division of life into public and private spheres, meant that in early modern England, people were more and more likely to be interacting with people that they did not know, and more likely to be interacting with people that they did not know how to place socially. It's not just that they hadn't met, it's that I don't know your rank, I don't know your station, I don't know how I should be responding to you. Now, if that was happening in England, it was happening much, much faster in the United States, where waves of internal and international migration meant people were always meeting people they did not know how to place. And that was further compounded by religious revivals that made the most important fact about a person if they had had some inner revolution of accepting Christ, not just whether they attended church. And so you didn't know the most important thing about a person when you met them. Now, I'll let you all make the analogies, but I would imagine that in Korea, the period of intense urbanization and industrialization set off some of these same dynamics of people having increasing encounters with people they didn't know. Now, all these moments produced great anxiety about who people really were. Anxiety that found expression in characters like the rake, who's this great character, the seducer from Victorian novels, or even early modern novels. The seducer who pretends to be something that he is not in order to walk away with the aristocrat's daughter. The hypocritical evangelist is another character type that emerges here. He seems like he's pious, but he's a charlatan. Don't be deceived. Or the king and the duke, two obviously fake aristocrats who are working a hustle on the Mississippi River in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. So you can feel the anxiety coursing through the cultural products of the time. And it's anxiety about, is this person who they really say they are? How do I know who they are? Sincerity arose as a cultural answer to the structural dislocations of modernity. The ideal of sincerity, as Trilling traced it, accepted modernity's fundamental split between public and private. It presumed the importance of public roles of many kinds. But this ideal of sincerity held that the real self was the self that you were not in public spaces, but in private spaces, when no one else was looking, like the private space of your home. So in this ideal, if a minister preached temperance, preached abstinence from alcohol in public, but then was a drunkard at home, well, who was he really? Well, he was really a drunkard, right? Because in this view, the private self, the self that you are when no one is looking, the self that you are in your home, that's the real self. Sincerity, then, was the virtue that stressed the coherence between your private self and your public self. Sincerity is the virtue of showing publicly who you actually are in private. It's the virtue of being in private the kind of person that you represent yourself as in public. It was not just a guarantor of public order, though it did resolve this great early modern anxiety, but then it takes on a kind of autonomy and it becomes a moral ideal in itself. All right, the power of sincerity as an ideal helped secure the new social order of early modernity in the West. Over time, though, it started to come undone, and the ideal of authenticity emerged, Trilling wrote, with a growing sense that a person's private life might correspond to their public role, but not to something that they thought of as their true self, that was prior to all social interactions, even in the private sphere. That is, one could be sincere, but still alienated. This possibility began to arise. It's there especially in romantic literature that prizes this kind of pre-social self as the seat of the sorts of experiences that are transcendent, that are the most valuable. It's there in Wordsworth, it's there in Emerson, it's there in these poets of Romanticism, it's there in Beethoven. And as this ideal of authenticity became increasingly important, a philosopher like Hegel could call sincerity, he's calling sincerity now, the heroism of dumb service. So sincerity becomes, well, you claim a kind of piety, you live that kind of piety, but you're alienated from your real self. This ideal of authenticity gained strength through movements like Romanticism, which stressed the pre-social self as the subject of our most meaningful experiences, and it percolated through artistic and bohemian subcultures of the 19th and 20th centuries. And it was absolutely bursting into power, as Trilling was writing in the 70s. What Americans call the 60s was really a revolution towards authenticity. The American Civil Rights Movement and then the global anti-imperial movements had named the injustice of social structures in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And as the 60s then rolled into 70s, that kind of questioning of institutions spread to every other sphere of society. So if conforming oneself to an unjust structure was what sincerity involved, then sincerity was suspect. Instead, people sought an authenticity that expressed a true self that was prior to the contamination of interaction with social structures. Now, the ideal of authenticity is not a kind of coherence between my public life and my private life. The ideal of authenticity is that we're going to be real with each other, man. We're just going to get together, connect, and be real. We're going to take off our social masks, and we're going to reveal who we really are. We're going to come out. We're going to express our true selves. The ideal of authenticity presumes an anthropology in which a true self, the ground of all that's really real, is behind and beneath social roles. Its moral aspirations center on the imperative to express this true self. As Michel Foucault wrote of this ethos, quote, "It seems to us that truth, lodged in our most secret nature, demands only to surface. It's a great analysis of this dynamic. There's a truth deep inside you, and what is most important is that you can share, express, and surface that truth. The moral imperative to express one's true self has all kinds of impact on our lives in both public roles and in spheres we usually regard as private. So the ideal of the real self apart from social roles, it both expresses and it invites alienation. And it can lead a priest to leave a church whose liturgical forms no longer speak to him. That's why we saw a mass exodus of Catholic priests in the US and across the West with this rise of authenticity. It can also lead a spouse to leave a marriage in which they no longer feel that love. You've lost that love and feeling, right? They no longer feel it in their hearts. With the rise of authenticity, we saw the highest divorce rates in the history of the US through the 70s and 80s. Authenticity undoes institutions in the name of the expressive freedom of the individual. I think Trilling's analysis was prescient. It's amazing that he could see these things in 1970, in the early 70s, right as they were happening. The shift from sincerity to authenticity that he diagnosed went along with an unraveling of institutions and this rise of expressive individualism. Now, the neoliberal politics and economics of the past 50 years have both reflected and accelerated this ideal of authenticity. It's had an impact on literally every part of American culture. Indeed, there is no way to make sense of the rise of Donald Trump without the destruction of the institutions and the rise of expressive individualism that the shift from sincerity to authenticity helps explain. But now that if you ask Trump supporters why do you support him, one of the first answers you'll get is he says out loud what everyone's feeling. What's he doing? He's expressing the deepest feelings that people have. And what else will they say? They'll say he's authentic. And they'll say, no, but look at all this stuff is all fake. No. Authenticity is something other than that. Authenticity is the kind of id. It's that pre-social self made public. And he rings the bells for that. But now this order of authenticity, and that's where my last book ended, was kind of saying, hey, we're in this time of authenticity. The problem is our churches and theological schools were built for an age of sincerity. They were built for these strong institutions. That world has passed away. We have this rise of this kind of a culture of authenticity. Our institutions are out of sync with it, and that explains the kind of crisis that we have. But the great thing about this invitation from Professor Lim is that it pushed me to think about hyperconnectivity. And in thinking about hyperconnectivity, I've come to think that the age of authenticity is already under great stress. So hyperconnectivity, that's where I am on the outline, hyperconnectivity. Early versions of the internet began to offer a kind of connectivity more than 40 years ago. In 1993, the first web browser took connectivity to another level. But what I'm calling hyperconnectivity really took off in the 2010s. And it's required a series of technological innovations, beginning with the invention and then the mass distribution of the smartphone. Now, the number of people owning a smartphone in the US increased extraordinarily rapidly, from 11% in 2008, the year of the first iPhone, to 75% in 2014, just 6 years later. And it's much higher now. So coupled with high bandwidth, low latency network infrastructures like broadband, 5G, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth, some of them pioneered right here, phones could connect to the internet at any time. And our phones are not just receiving data. Smartphones, along with the smartwatches and rings and glasses, the network sensors, and more that they have spawned, they are also always transmitting data about us. Cloud computing has evolved to be able to hold all that data, and now AI is training on that data and learning how to represent it to us and learning how to represent it to itself. These technological conditions make possible hyperconnectivity, in which, and this is the kind of language I want to use to describe hyperconnectivity, practically universal, ubiquitous, ambient mediations are collected, represented, and redistributed in feedback loops that are incorporated into legible selves. That is a very complex sentence, even for somebody who wrote it. So I want to slow down and consider each phrase one by one. Hyperconnectivity depends on practically universal participation. I say practically because some people choose to opt out as much as they can, and others simply can't afford to opt in. But the numbers of the people who do opt in are incredible. Facebook now has 3 billion active users. WhatsApp and Instagram are both over 2 billion. WeChat over 1.25 billion. TikTok started in 2016, and it got to 1 billion users in just 5 years. 97.5% of Koreans in their 20s use KakaoTalk. I do too, yeah, because I want to talk to people here. And if you do, that's just what you do. And there are over 1 billion messages exchanged on KakaoTalk each month. And even if a person does not use any of these services, they still are tracked by surveillance cameras, biometric devices, credit card purchases, cookies on the web, and more. When I first started, even when I was writing this, I was thinking that there were people who were too poor, too marginalized to leave a digital trail. But as I have walked around Seoul and as I've reflected on Atlanta, I actually think there's more data being collected on poorer people even than people who are wealthier, because of the constant surveillance of CCTV, and because if you're in the streets for much of the day, the state knows where you are. Right? If we move around in private spaces, the state might not know where we are. If anything, wealth can insulate you to some degree from hyperconnectivity. But most people who have the wealth that could insulate them end up using it to connect even more. So not absolutely, but practically, we're all hyperconnected. Hyperconnectivity depends on ubiquity. It aspires not just to collect data on all people, but to collect data on all people in all places at all times. Now, this kind of ubiquity depends, we can't just be sending data up all the time, so it depends on what I'll call ambient collection, passive collection, where it's being collected even if we don't push a button to send our location to the web. Our smartphone's already done it. I did not go to some central data clearinghouse to say that I was traveling to Korea, but the hyperconnected, before I even had made my plane reservation, the hyperconnected web was already offering me experiences in Korea. Practically universal, ubiquitous, ambient hyperconnectivity does not connect my flesh and blood directly with the flesh and blood of others. Instead, what it connects are digital mediations of every part of life. My watch transmits data that mediates my heart rate. Commerce platforms mediate my buying and selling. My intellectual life depends on libraries and data that I access electronically. Spotify mediates my love of music and helps me control my moods. Email and text messages mediate even my closest social relationships, on and on. And these mediations of every part of life, even the most intimate, they are collected, represented, and redistributed across all kinds of contexts. They are collected, they're swept up into the cloud. Algorithms then analyze the data to create further representations of these representations. And then those representations are circulated to interested parties, including people who want to sell me things or just know where I am and what I'm doing. This is the real shift with hyperconnectivity. With an older style of connectivity, my connection was bounded. I would send a person an email. That was me talking to that person. It's a bounded communication. But with hyperconnectivity, the connections are always spilling out of their bounds. They're always overflowing. They're leaping into new contexts. Or with connectivity, I might go to a chat room. I have the conversation in the chat room with the people who are there. But with hyperconnectivity, the fact that I've gone into that chat room was tracked, and it's already generated the data about the fact that I'm the kind of person who goes to that kind of chat room, right? So hyperconnectivity is always spilling beyond contexts. It's always going to new contexts. But even the most local bounded connections produce traces that get aggregated for other contexts. With hyperconnectivity, we're not just connected to this or that particular context, we are all connected to connectivity itself. With hyperconnectivity, you're not just connected to other people or other contexts, you're connected to connectivity. There's a meta dimension that hyperconnectivity takes on. And these connections then, they come back to us in feedback loops that are stamped with data from others. And we incorporate that language of incorporation. If you go back to the Latin root, it is to say in corpus. We take this into our bodies. The feedback loops become part of our bodies, part of our lives, in at least two different ways. First, the feedback loops shape the bodies that we see. Hyperconnectivity accelerates what social theorist Niklas Luhmann called second-order observation, in which we don't just see a thing, but we see the thing as it has been seen by others. So feedback loops are incorporated into our direct perception of reality. This is true when we see an Instagram post that comes to us, and with the post, we already know how many people have liked it, right? So the feedback loop is there in our first impression of the post. We already know how many times this tweet has been retweeted. And it's there in a restaurant's webpage that includes their Yelp reviews, right? My experience of the restaurant has built into it the feedback of others. And it doesn't then just shape what I see, but it shapes my actions, because I read those reviews and it determines which restaurant I go to and then what I choose when I order. And all the algorithms only intensify this process. With algorithms, second-order observations may determine whether we ever see something at all. So all those embedded feedback loops shape our expectations, and so they shape whether we have experienced something as disappointing, as better than expected, or as just a fulfillment of what we already knew. What I want to say here most strongly is our bodily experience itself is already mediated by hyperconnectivity. The way we experience the world is already mediated. Then we incorporate these feedback loops, we turn them into bodies in other ways too. For when ambient hyperconnectivity is constantly collecting data about us, we are always on display. We are in what Byung-Chul Han has called a performance society, in which we always have powerful incentives to curate the version of ourselves we are presenting to others. This dynamic is accelerated when we are given feedback like likes or retweets that stand in for the approval or rejection of the group. That feedback is addictive. We watch it obsessively. We court the feedback that we want, and we curate ourselves accordingly. This curation amounts to a kind of advanced compliance with the assumed norms of the generalized others that we meet through hyperconnectivity. This is most obvious in the ways that we curate the image of ourselves that we project online. We might use a filter to shape the way our face appears, but we also might curate in less obvious ways, selecting the people, places, and things we want to include in the images we post. Post a selfie with this person, but not with that person, even if we had a meal or something together. But we curate these images, and it extends beyond representations of ourselves to our lived experience. In an extreme case, I might decide a filter is not enough, that I need plastic surgery to get my selfies right. And this is happening on a massive scale, right? It's not a one-off kind of thing. And on a smaller scale, I might decide that I need to go to Common Ground so that I can post selfies from there, because that would show that I am edgy and arty and streetwise, or that I'm a middle-aged professor trying desperately and unsuccessfully to look cool. The main point is this: our desires to curate our lives for hyperconnected viewers don't just shape the way we represent our lives, they shape the ways we actually live our lives. That's hyperconnectivity. #NoFilter. As I will argue in what follows, hyperconnectivity is undermining and hollowing out the conditions of sincerity and authenticity, gradually replacing them. Now, when they first appeared, many of the components of hyperconnectivity seemed like they might offer great resources for the expressive individualism that the ideal of authenticity requires. This is, I think, one of the great ironies. Authenticity, all those drives to express ourselves, when the first offerings of the internet came, authenticity said, yes, please, more, more, more. A blog that has no gatekeeper, where I can just share my feelings, that's the ideal of authenticity, right? A place where I can connect with my friends and share my feelings, great. But now my expressions can go viral. I can really express myself. So in their early versions, these technologies promised to amplify expressive individualism. And that promise is what really let them take root in a society that prized authenticity. Something like blogs or Facebook, these things, they would have been totally uninteresting to people of another culture. But where authenticity was so strong, that desire to express ourselves, that is what really let them take off. But as these technologies moved into hyperconnectivity, they began to create what Byung-Chul Han has called, quote, a digital panopticon of mutual surveillance. In the early modern panopticon of Jeremy Bentham, that Michel Foucault has analyzed to such great effect, prisoners were always subject to the gaze of guards they could not see. And eventually they internalized the gaze of those guards so thoroughly that the guard tower doesn't even need to be staffed. You probably know this story, Foucault's great fable. But in the mutual panopticon of hyperconnectivity, there aren't any guards necessarily. We're monitoring each other. The digital society of control makes intensive use of freedom, Han wrote. The society of control makes use of freedom. Catch that paradox. It's only possible thanks to voluntary self-illumination and self-exposure. It exploits freedom. The society of control achieves perfection when its inhabitants do not communicate because of external constraints, but because of internal need. That is when the fear of giving up a private and intimate sphere yields to the need to put oneself on display shamelessly. We're more afraid, FOMO is stronger than the desire for a privacy that could shelter authenticity. That is, hyperconnectivity makes use of the desires of authenticity to create a disciplinary system that ends up undermining the condition of authenticity. It's kind of one of the hinge points in this talk, so I'll say it again. Hyperconnectivity makes use of the desires of authenticity to create a disciplinary system that ends up undermining the conditions of authenticity. The residue of a culture of authenticity still assigns great value to all the tropes that signal authenticity. And so the hyperconnected world prizes authenticity. It rewards people for displaying it or something like it, and we want to express ourselves authentically, especially in a way that other people will recognize as authentic. But that desire to seem authentic, it instrumentalizes authenticity. It makes it a means to another end. That is, it integrates authenticity into a larger social process. But remember, authenticity has the power that it has because we take it to be prior to social processes. And so it's pure and uncontaminated in a way. And so when we use it instrumentally, it loses that power, and we undermine the conditions of authenticity. To put it, take it to the ground, the hashtag #NoFilter only has value because it marks an image as somehow more real than it would otherwise be. And it seems more real because it is not part of a social process that would compromise it in some way. But when authenticity gets turned into a hashtag, it no longer stands prior to and apart from the processes that would compromise it. The hashtag makes authenticity part of a brand. And there's nothing less authentic than having or being a brand. The conditions of authenticity are further eroded by the networked privacy that hyperconnectivity encourages. Networked privacy, what I'm calling network privacy, it undoes the public-private distinction. But both sincerity and authenticity depend on the public-private distinction that emerged in the West in early modern times. Architecturally, the public-private distinction looked like the steady separation of spaces for work, politics, and culture from the home. All these things used to be done in the home, but with modernity, they're separated. That's what it looks like architecturally. Legally, it looks like the Bill of Rights in the US, which carved out rights to privacy. This separation of public and private is the native soil in which sincerity and authenticity grow. Their whole logic depends on a public-private distinction. But with the incorporation of feedback loops that hyperconnectivity encourages, the boundaries between public and private just come undone. There is no place where the smartphone cannot go with us. So one can post or shop or otherwise express oneself even from the bathtub. Even more, the feedback loops of hyperconnectivity press us to modify the selves we present to others. And this pressure extends not just to how we represent ourselves, this pressure, but to who we actually are. So interiority is replaced by interactivity. Interiority is replaced by interactivity. In media, the purest form of this is clickbait, content that has no substance beyond its attractiveness to the hyperconnectivity apparatus. But even better content gets modified to fit the algorithmic gaze. I was in a meeting of an advisory board for a distinguished academic journal last week, and we had an extended conversation about what we needed to do to optimize the articles in this academic journal for the search engine so that they could be discovered, and what kind of articles we needed to select that would be discoverable. When we have internalized the mediated views of others so thoroughly that they shape how we live and think, then we can't sustain a strong distinction between a public that's out there and a private that is internal to us. And without that kind of public-private split, how can we make sense of sincerity and authenticity? That's why it doesn't make sense to say an Instagram selfie is not authentic. That's a category mistake. It's like saying it doesn't produce chlorophyll. I mean, of course it doesn't. That's not even what it's trying to do. It's not what it's made to do. So hyperconnectivity, I want to say, unravels authenticity as an ideal. Now, this does not mean that desires for it are not still strong, nor that the appearance of authenticity does not still have power to legitimate. It just means that the rise of hyperconnectivity undermines the conditions for authenticity and hollows it out. And it prepares the ground for a new ideal of the self that I will call legibility. I want to propose legibility as a kind of successor to Trilling's pair of modern ideals for the self in the West. Sincerity, and then authenticity that kind of arose through Romanticism into the 60s, and now the legibility. So sincerity, authenticity, legibility. I should be clear that I'm trying to analyze these social changes, not call for them. So I do not mean to encourage you to make yourselves legible. I mean to show you how hyperconnectivity is already pressing all of us in this direction. I mean to critique these pressures by historicizing them and by bringing them to consciousness. Legibility here is more than mere visibility. It's the drive of the self to be not just visible, but intelligible, recognizable. And in this age, that means the self needs to be discoverable. It needs to be formatted in such a way that algorithmic readers, both human and machine, can make sense and so make value from it. The legible self makes sure it can be read by including the reading of others in its presentations of itself, like the article that features keywords for search engines, or the Instagram post from Starfield Library, or the restaurant website that includes a positive review that determines what's still on the menu. The legible self has so internalized both past and anticipated readings that they have become a part of it. The feedback loops then can comprehend the legible self because they find themselves already in it. The legible self is made by hyperconnectivity, but it's also hyperconnectivity's solution to the crises that it faces. I described that with sincerity. The crisis of early modernity is, who are these people really? And the crisis of authenticity is, I'm alienated from my social roles. The crisis, I think, of hyperconnectivity are slightly different. At the root of these crises is the hyper nature of connectivity itself. When we're always connecting to all these kinds of entities just by moving through the world, always getting information, always giving information, how can we know whom to trust? Sincerity answered the problem of trust with practices for displaying the private self in public. Authenticity responded to the crisis of trust through transgressions that marked a real self that was not just a means to some end. Legibility responds to this new crisis of trust through incorporation of the readings of others into the presentation of the self. Incorporating the readings of others into the presentation of the self. And so a rideshare platform proves a driver is trustworthy by including his 5-star rating. And the driver knows that he can pick up a particular passenger because the passenger profile shows high ratings from past drivers. And the social credit system in China is, to me, this on a massive social scale. Each is presenting the readings of others to make themselves legible as trustworthy. Because the platform sustains this system, riders and drivers trust the platform. If hyperconnectivity then creates crisis of trust in relation to others, in relation to ourselves, it creates a crisis of recognition. Now, in bounded communities like a neighborhood or like a church or even like a school at its best or a labor union, people give and receive recognition to one another. Joining that kind of community brings recognition with it. People are going to know you. They know your name. They care about you. They recognize you for who you are. But with hyperconnectivity, these mediations of ourselves, they jump from one context to another. So hyperconnectivity erodes the boundaries that keep communities small enough to guarantee recognition to members. It's always pressing to wider and more general contexts. And these massified contexts tend to concentrate most of the recognition with a very few people. We go from a small town where everybody knows your name to an almost infinite web in which BTS are recognized by millions, while ordinary users are lucky to have a handful of followers. Having any friends or followers or connections requires making yourself legible. This suggests the moral aspiration of legibility. It's a desire to be recognized, known, received, validated. I want you to note the shift from authenticity. Authenticity stressed free expression of a unique individual self, untainted by society. Legibility, on the other hand, stresses not free expression, but genuine recognition. It values not being able to tell people who we are, but being able to be known for who we are. And it intentionally takes the social into itself in order to become knowable. So the shift from sincerity to authenticity named a shift in the center of the culture. But it was never total. Ideals of sincerity persisted in both individuals and institutions. Likewise, the shift to legibility that I'm trying to name is not complete. It's still in process. And even as it grows, it's unlikely to displace pockets of sincerity and authenticity. They all exist together, like a hunnock next to a skyscraper. The whole history of the city is right there on the surface. But even if the rise of legibility is in its early stages, it is rapidly gaining in power, and it is moving to more and more spheres of society, because it both fits and shapes increasingly powerful economic forms, like platform capitalism and the attention economy. In the attention economy, legibility is essential for value. The recognition necessary for understanding ourselves as human beings depends on legibility. And both social and economic capital depend on legibility. As a moral ideal, then, legibility has some autonomy in relation to the forms of political economy. But its alliance with the dominant forms of political economy, the rising forms, they give it great power. Against transparency. Critics of hyperconnectivity give a grim picture of what it feels like to live as a self in a hyperconnected world. Hyperconnectivity brings a kind of restlessness, for ambient collection of our data means that we are always on. We are always presenting a self to the world. Even when we sleep, if we're wearing a smartwatch, we are sending data to the cloud. And if we are not, our activity on our phones right before we go to bed or right after says a lot about our bedtimes, our morning routines, and our moods. So there is no rest from hyperconnectivity. Because of that, we find ourselves anxious, for we are subject to constant judgment of both algorithms and individual people. Even if our last post got a lot of likes, the next one might not. So we are always subject to judgment and evaluation. Hyperconnectivity also leaves us feeling fragmented, for our represented selves are not just confined to the digital space we choose. Digital representations, as I said before, they jump contexts, they travel endlessly. Data about us can be chopped and recombined with other data for many different uses. Now, because these representations produce feedback loops, the different places our data go to are all coming back to us. They're all talking to us, shaping our experience of ourselves. No wonder we feel fragmented. And the pressure to curate ourselves it can end in narcissism and loneliness. Narcissism, because we focus so much on ourselves and representations of ourselves that we struggle to see others as anything but competitors or generators of material that we could remix in our own self-presentations, or sources of potential likes, comments, or repostings. This stance leaves us with more connections than relationships. Moreover, hyperconnectivity naturalizes a world in which the dominant powers fill up our feeds. Large language models work by processing huge amounts of data and then using that data to predict what words might work best next. So they reproduce not only the past, but also the predicted future of power. They dominate our sensory field. And when we find ourselves then pressed to conform, for we know that the best way to be visible is to conform to the images that already dominate the feedback loops. One of the ways I talk to my students about using AI is to show them that ChatGPT, without much provocation, is just super racist. Well, why is it racist? Because it's trained on the internet. And what's on the internet? The dominant views of the society. You train on that, it's what you reproduce, right? What I mean to say here is just that hyperconnectivity, it naturalizes this world in which the dominant powers get reproduced. It's not just that the hyperconnected apparatus is always trying to shape our desires and sell us things, though it is. No, our conformation to the market runs deeper than that. For in our posting and in our surfing, and increasingly just in our living, we are generating data that is processed, packaged, and sold. So with hyperconnectivity, we don't just buy commodities, we become commodities. One of the most sustained and important critiques of these realities comes from philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who I've already made reference to. Han argues that hyperconnectivity creates what he calls a transparency society of perfect legibility that, quote, eliminates otherness. The truly other is illegible, he says, and so not recognized in relationship. The other, capital O other, disappears. And so we lose not only the goodness of encountering the other, but also of being the other ourselves. In response, Han calls for practices that he variously labels as secrecy or invisibility, some kind of negativity that preserves a space for otherness and freedom. He produces something like these practices himself, refusing to use social media, minimizing his digital footprint, giving few interviews, and maintaining long times of silence. Han is striving for illegibility. But Han's commitment to illegibility misses the unintended consequences of his actions. He might intend to be illegible, but he has emerged as a very coherent global brand. His books exert wide influence. They are perfectly legible, and he is legible as one who desires to minimize his legibility. And even if Han's calls to illegibility could be realized, they're trying to offer shelter for what I would call an uncritical kind of authenticity. As a moral aspiration, authenticity is not identical to the late capitalist economy and society with which it is entangled. But the German critical theorist Theodor Adorno was right to insist that, quote, precisely as an absolute, the authentic individual is a mere reflection of late capitalist property relations. Authenticity is nothing other than a defiant and obstinate insistence on the monadological form which social oppression imposes on us. And so the authenticity of Han and of Heidegger, who Adorno's arguing with and who stands behind Han, is an ideological expression of late capitalism. Writing in the 1960s, just a few years after Adorno, and when the ideal of authenticity was rising to peak influence, the Trappist monk Thomas Merton argued that one who is obsessed with his inner unity is failing to face his disunion with God and other people. For it is on union with others that our own inner unity is naturally and easily established. So to be preoccupied with achieving inner unity first and then going on to love others is to follow the logic of disruption that is contrary to life. I think Merton's right. Legibility might have its problems. Cult of authenticity also takes on ideological forms that can leave us isolated and alone. Simply rejecting legibility to try to renew the cult of authenticity does not treat authenticity nearly critically enough. All right, last section. Redeeming legibility. So it's a lecture in a school of theology. There hasn't been a lot of theology so far. It's time. How might Christians respond? Well, there has been theology. It's just woven through. How might Christians respond to the crises created by hyperconnectivity? I can only offer a sketch, but I want to start from two premises. The first premise is that we cannot simply opt out of hyperconnectivity or the legibility it demands. But neither should we take them on their own terms. Instead, we should work for a critical redemption of legibility. We can't opt out, so we have to try to redeem the world in which we find ourselves. The second premise, the fundamental Christian response to these social realities is not just a set of ideas, but it is a living social reality. So it's not just theology, it's church. Redeeming legibility begins with recognizing the moral core of the ideal, not just expressing oneself, but being known, received, accepted, recognized. These are good things. To be known, to be received, to be recognized for who you are. This is a good thing. And this is the moral inspiration behind a movement like #SayYourName, which recognizes the stories of victims of sexual abuse, takes them seriously, treats them as real, receives the people, and accepts and recognizes them for who they are. It promises to offer recognition to people who have otherwise been rendered invisible. This moral core of legibility also becomes clear in exercises in which we claim some identity or pronouns or a name for ourselves, and it opens into an ideal of mutual intelligibility and solidarity. Because if we invoke the ideal of legibility to ask other people to give us recognition on moral grounds, then that involves us in an implicit connection to offer recognition to others. So that desire for legibility, that desire for recognition, has a potentially infinite horizon. Christians might also respond to the challenge by recognizing the ways hyperconnectivity is already theological. The more I thought about hyperconnectivity, the more I came to think of it as a parody of Christian theology. It's like a parody of an omniscient God, because it sees all, but without mercy. Likewise, our performances of legibility are like parodies of Christian liturgies of confession, for they ask us to tell all without offering any absolution in return. Seeing this parodic element, seeing that hyperconnectivity is already theological in some sense, it's just bad theology, it reminds us that legibility can't even keep its own promises. It is never perfectly achieved. And here's my real break with Hahn. Hahn describes a society of transparency. Hahn thinks hyperconnectivity works, that we really can see all the way into a life. I think we can see a long way in, and I've tried to say the reasons why, in part because the self is modified to become legible. But what legibility implies is not transparency, it's that it is a text that can be read. I know there are Bible scholars in the house, and you know that something can be legible without being transparent, right? Legibility reminds us that even the best algorithm does not have transparent access to a real human life. Instead, it's reading a kind of digital text that has been translated from data. As German Jewish thinker Walter Benjamin saw, translations are never complete. On the contrary, the attempt to translate makes visible the gap between the translation and the original text. And in Benjamin's eschatological poetics of failure, that gap between original and translation bears witness to hopes for reconciliation. Just so, attempts to translate lives into data always and necessarily fail. We all outrun, exceed, underperform, or simply don't match the data that claim to represent us. No matter how much we internalize them, we are not our hyperconnected profiles. We are not our profiles. But we long for the relationships that hyperconnectivity promises. We long to be known in the way the profile promises. That longing might take shape as a church in which people relate to one another, offering one another the recognition we all need, but with a consciousness that we do not fully know one another. And we can relate to one another without total knowledge of one another. As post-colonial thinker Edouard Glissant has argued, it is the empire that seeks total comprehension through technologies like maps, linguistics, anthropology, and other tools for comprehension that end in control. And this hyperconnectivity is the heir to empire. It's the tool of empire today. But in the face of these demands, Glissant argues for the value of what he calls opacity. And then he casts a vision for how these opacities might come together as what he calls relation. I want to build on Glissant's ideas to dream of a church in a hyperconnected age as a relation in which we cherish one another exactly in our mutual opacity, to love someone who you don't know all the way through, but in that loving to give them a kind of benefit of the doubt, call it grace, in which we offer one another mutual recognition without total comprehension. And the ways in this model, the ways we do not know each other, they don't separate us, but they kindle in us our desire for one another and our hope for a world in which we know, even as we are fully known, in a mutual knowledge that finds its culmination not in domination, but in love. Thank you very much.